Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for asking me to join you today for this final conference of the Caring Dads programme. I've been fortunate enough to be involved in this for several years now, and it's been a great pleasure to work with people from all the host countries and to see the enormous progress that people have made. So today I'm going to talk about the programme from a particular perspective. I'm going to try to, as much as I possibly can, think about the wider systems within which the programme is embedded. We have a saying in Caring Dads that if the child has to deal with them, then we have to deal with them. So for a lot of the families that we're working with, the child experiences the father as a fact in his life. We may not kind of think that that's a good thing. We may, in fact, want to get him out of the house. But even if we do that, in some way, shape or form, the child still has an idea of the father, and the child will still be influenced by the father's current past behaviour. So if we have to deal with them, if the child has to deal with them, has to talk with them, has to manage his behaviour, and is impacted by that behaviour, then that's something we need to seriously consider. So we'll roughly cover the Caring Dads programme principles, the 5 principles of the programme, and what that means both for implementation and for the actual delivery of the programme. Thinking about the implementation of the programme within wider systems, in particular in relation to interagency practice and what might be involved in actually rolling it successfully out into a community, and always to think about the implications of implementation for children, women and men. You'll hear I have a bit of a cold. Very sorry about that. Bit nasal. So Caring Dads essentially is on a continuum of service. Down this end in service provision, we might have universal promotion of father involvement, perhaps paternity leave and things of that nature. Quite weak in the UK, in fact, where I'm actually working, and it may actually be different in the host nations. Then you might have education and support programs, particularly with babies and younger children, antenatal classes, things of that nature, and until we move into therapeutic interventions for fathers and families, and they may be things like parenting programs and things of that nature. Caring Dads is very much up here. We know that the dads that we're working with are not really doing a good job, and almost invariably there are elements of domestic violence and abuse which we would consider to be catastrophic failures of parenting. So the police may be involved, the courts, child protection or children's services, shelters, refuges, all of those kind of crisis agencies are likely to be involved with the fathers that we're working with. I suppose it's worth thinking about, does punishment work? Well, that kind of depends. I'm from a criminal justice background. I was a probation officer for many years. So I'm okay with arrest and prosecution. It definitely has its place, and for, in particular, the higher risk offenders, it's an essential part of the system and could always do with being strengthened. But domestic abuse is a much bigger problem that any one agency can deal with. It's a social problem. Legal redress is just part of the solution, but not and can never be the whole thing. If we think about intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, that might kind of point us in the right direction. Extrinsic motivation is when I do things because some exterior force is making me do it. So a lot of the time when I have extrinsic motivation, I'll try to avoid that, surprise, surprise, as much as I possibly can. And I may think that it's unjust, that I should be actually called to account for my behaviour and to make changes about it. Intrinsic motivation, in fact, is when I feel I need to change. And really, the Caring Dads programme is built on a model that tries to promote intrinsic motivation. Intrinsic motivation lasts longer. It means people bring in their self-efficacy, in other words, their own ability to think through and make changes and maintain them over time. We try to promote that in the program and also in the parenting style that we talk about in Caring Dads. We try to make very clear that hitting children, humiliating them, putting them down, calling them names, all of those parenting behaviours are out as far as we're concerned. You'll have to think of different ways to parent the child, and in fact I'll refer to that very briefly later on. If we are thinking about punishment, what would punishment involve? Would it involve, for example, a short prison sentence, maybe 3 or 4 days, as I know is kind of not uncommon in some places? Now, the 3 or 4 days may give a family time to think and to reflect, and it may be a motivation factor for bigger changes at a later stage. Or it may make him just angrier. It may make him vengeful. It may make him want to get his own back on mum and child or children, because they're maybe the most available people. Maybe he won't hit a police officer. Maybe he will hit his partner. So punishment, we'll have to think that through a little bit. Some modes of punishment might work better than others. We do know, however, beyond a shadow of a doubt, and whatever jurisdiction you go to, it's pretty much the same thing, that prison generally makes families poorer. So whereas we do not want to support his violence and abuse, on occasion our actions may have the result of making the family suffer. As we often say in the groups, we generally start off in the first session, we have no magic wand. If you had a magic wand, you would have done that already. And it turns out punishment may be part of the picture, but it's certainly not a magic wand. So in the wider system, and I have had the pleasure and the good fortune to have worked in several different countries over the years, we see the same pattern. So if a man is being violent to his partner within the home, quite often what we want to do is get him out of the house. Getting him out of the house, again, as in punishment and so on, does have its place. It may give her time and space for action, is what we would typically describe that as. In longer-term domestic abuse relationships, women are often making decisions through a prism of how will he respond? What will he think about this? What are the consequences if I make this choice? How will he respond back to that? So she may have some time and space to do things differently, to leave the home, to go and live somewhere else, to put protection measures in place perhaps. It's a little bit worrying, however, in that we're already thinking about women as being responsible for resolving the violence. This is a kind of a pattern that's played out again and again. Women are punished essentially by children's services and other services, and indeed by their own communities, for not protecting their children. It's somehow seen as their responsibility, and socially it's a pretty kind of common sort of social norm that women are generally seen as being responsible for caring, for nurturing. And we kind of think, well, funny enough, men can do that too. And we probably need to raise our expectations of men. Otherwise, we end in a kind of a sexist sort of situation where assumptions that are broadly available socially about women's role in caring for families actually are used against her. But we think about what's happening with this man. Where is he going? Is he kind of sofa surfing? Is he homeless? Is he living back with his parents? Is he isolated, lonely, depressed, perhaps drinking too much? And is anybody talking to him? Is anybody giving him the opportunity to consider and to change his behavior? Or are we just happy to have him out of the house? Quite often, that's the way our systems work. You think about the consequences for children in these situations. One thing I've noticed from being in a lot of refuges over the years is that the child or children may act in one way when father is in the home, but when he's not there, they may act in a very different way, and in fact may act out in accordance with what they have experienced. The experience of being safe is not always a simple one, and it doesn't always mean that people suddenly kind of are just all happy and kind of thinking, great, whole new life. Quite often what happens is that there is a store of pain and hurt and trauma that has been waiting for them, and they have not been able to deal with that, or perhaps even look at it, because they're managing the day-to-day. They're managing avoiding abuse, avoiding getting hit, and managing the situation that they find themselves in. And when they no longer have to do that, not always, but quite often, the children then experience a lot of the things that they were blocking until that time. So it may look to people when the children are perhaps acting out in various ways, because children's behavior, particularly for younger children, is their form of communication. They may not be able to articulate clearly what they're thinking and feeling, and so they may physically demonstrate it instead. This may have the consequence of people having a view of mother as somebody who is not capable of disciplining or looking after or nurturing her children. So again, it may be that this is a situation that generates blame of mother. And I think we can probably do better than that. The kind of things we hear are very common. I've heard these things many times. Quite often this notion that despite father's violence and his suicide attempts, he's still a good father. Father is uncaring and horrible, but he'd be all right with the baby and he wants to bond. So essentially this kind of boils down to a model where we see father's parenting and his father-ness, as you will, as separate from other aspects of his personality. Quite often people will say things like, well, he's a terrible partner, terrible husband, but he's a good dad. That's a very kind of seductive idea, but it's also quite stupid. They are, after all, the same job. They're in the same job description, and we cannot separate these things out. To be a good father is to be a reasonable partner or husband. It's part of a whole, and we can't separate the two things out. Fathers say things like, no one's going to come between me and my children because they are mine. And this kind of indicates an attitude of the children are property. They are mine. Now, there's a bit of a problem with that in that, first of all, it may be self-evident that children are not property. And in actual fact, as parents, we're fortunate enough to be responsible for our children. To be perhaps looking after them, to be custodians of our children, but we're not their owners, as it were. It's because of the unconditional love they give you. You can't get love like that from anywhere else. And there is a definite truth in that. Anybody who's seen their fathers among you, who have seen your child being born, are probably quite aware of that feeling that one gets that is quite unique and different from any other feeling that you might have. You may love your partners or your parents or even your friends and other people around you, but the love you feel for the child and the love that you get back is quite a unique thing. In our program, that of course may be a really strong intrinsic motivation for a man to actually want to change his behavior. And of course, if we don't work with him, he has a tendency to be able to game the system by ringing up social workers and making complaints, for example, ringing the police, asserting that she has assaulted him, things of that nature. So if we're not talking to him, he's free to do all sorts of things in the system that might not be in the children's interest. So kind of to sum it up, really, There's kind of 4 basic themes. I'm guessing we could probably think of more. But the risk to children increases if we don't include fathers due to his isolation and depression, sometimes substance misuse or alcohol misuse attached to that. Women, mothers, are left with the responsibility of protecting children without the support of our intervention systems, and quite frequently blamed for not protecting their children. Fathers move on to other families, and in fact, when they do so, they are more risky in their other families. And we just lose an opportunity to promote change in men and in the father-child relationships. I'm a social worker by training, and I feel, in a sense, I do not have to justify offering the opportunity to change. I think people are valuable and deserve those opportunities if we're in a place to provide them. Safer practice might look like talking to him, asking him to safety plan instead of mom and children, asking him what things could he do to keep the family safer, that perhaps agencies might monitor and assess the risk he poses, not only now, but on an ongoing basis. And we then will kind of generate collaboration between system agencies and agents, which certainly is true in domestic violence interventions, is one of the key determinants of safety for families, for family members that come in contact with the system. An approach like that may offer opportunities for her to seek interventions for trauma and violence. She may be supported to keep herself and her children safe. And of course, there may be support for housing and other practical matters. In Judith Herman's classic trauma model, there are 3 stages. The first one is safety. Then we move to testimony or witness, and then we move to community integration. The safety bit is key. Unless the person feels psychologically and physically safe, the recovery from trauma is difficult, if not impossible. Testimony is talking about your story, being believed, being validated, and being able to share that story with not only professionals, but perhaps with other people who've experienced similar issues. And once that process has moved on, you may then be able to get to community integration and back to a normal life, as much as that might be possible. We do have to be careful in the system of things that sometimes, rarely in my experience, but may well happen. So the father may use the program to gain leverage in custody and access. But this, I mean, father may say, oh, I've been on this program. I'll tell the judge all about that. And then the judge may think, oh, well, he's been on. Now, I know judges are not stupid people, but sometimes we may feel that because a person has done an intervention, that change has happened. And of course, that is not always the case. So you can see that there are some risks there associated with how he might use the fact that he has done this intervention in a way that is not appropriate. He may use the program material to undermine children's mothers, and that might be very simply, he goes to a session, they talk about child-centered fathering and some practices in that kind of context, and he goes home and tells his wife, well, you're not doing this. The group facilitators say this is how you should deal with this, but you're not doing that. And that clearly is not the intention of the program. It also points us in the direction of the need to have strong relationships between program providers and mothers in the families that we're working with. We'll talk later about what that might look like for children. The program may overtake or undermine services addressing the safety needs of women and children. That's a possibility, particularly in times when there isn't much money for services. and commissioners and people are making decisions and choices about what they will fund. My experience in the UK is that women's services and services for children experiencing domestic abuse are underfunded and have shrank in the last 10 years or so. My experience of services working with men are there isn't a great deal of it. So the amount of money that these services attract in comparison to services of women and children is extremely small. But that doesn't take away our responsibility for ensuring that we are not competing for resources. But however, those are the kind of perhaps philosophical and financial discussions that need to be had within communities who are considering taking the programme on. Current progress needs to be balanced with the history of abusive behaviour. You may well find, in actual fact, that you can promote short-term and immediate responses in terms of stopping violence and abuse and other kind of bad behaviours. But it's a danger just to see the current situation as representing what's actually happened in the relationship as a whole. And we need, as facilitators, program managers and other people, always to be aware of that. There are, of course, other cautions that I might address, but our experience of the program indicates that these are some of the things that we really should be paying attention to from the outset. So the program and principles, we have 5 program principles. So I'll just say a very short bit, because I'm sure this has been covered already today, about what is the program, and then we'll start to look at what are the principles and how do they operate in the real world. So it's a 17-week group program, 2-hour group and individual sessions, usually 8 to 12 fathers, thereabouts, and referrals usually through Child Protective Services, perhaps Criminal Justice Services and other associated services. There should always be at least the offer of mother contact. Not all mothers will want to take up that contact. The contact essentially really is to give mums information about the program, to say what they might expect, what kind of attendance there will be, and also when talking to mothers, we may get a better sense of the kind of risks that she is experiencing and things that perhaps we should be looking out for when we're working with him. There needs to be coordinated case management. By this, we just mean that the people in the program and the people referring and other agencies that are involved with the father should talk to each other and share information about progress and risk and other issues. Quite simple, really. So, as we said, if the child has to deal with them, then we do. Generally, we can't work with people where there's severe alcohol or drug use. If he has to use drugs or drink to get out of bed in the morning, it's probably not the right program for him. Men whose denial is extremely high, if he's kind of really deep in denial and doesn't accept any responsibility, generally he'll vote with his feet, as they say over here. In other words, he won't turn up. But at the same time, we have worked with men where denial and the level of denial has been high, and it is possible to make some progress. So the decision you will be making in an early stage is not how much he is denying, but how much he is willing to own, and does he have the motivation to actually change things or address his behavior in any meaningful sort of a way. Low risk dads, probably not appropriate for this program. Giving high risk interventions to low risk people tends to make them worse. The sexual abuse, sexual interest, history of sexual interest or concerns about sexual interest in children, no. One of our main guiding principles is to try to create a closer relationship between the father and his child. And as you can see, that would not work very well when men are sexually interested in children. We do not take men who have no contact with their children, because we are asking them to practice the skills that they are taught on the program between sessions. There's no point coming along to a program, sitting there talking to the other 8 to 10 men and then forgetting about it for a week. It needs to actively be practiced in the community and in the family. Also, we do not use the program as a way of how would I say, assessing for child contact. That's not our job. Our job may be to contribute to such an assessment, but we're not doing the assessment. Occasionally men, their partners openly object to their involvement. I think in all the programs I have run, I only came across that about once, maybe twice. Those cases, it was very clear that attendance on the program and associated activities was making things worse for her. So we had no doubt that we took him off the program because it was the safer thing to do. It doesn't happen all that often, but it does happen. You have to be particularly careful where there's active or imminent court involvement. The court arena tends to change things, tends to change people's motivation, the way they express motivation, and what they will and will not do. Again, the counter to that would always be to work closely with the people who were involved in any court proceedings. So we definitely need a new sort of program, a program that perhaps addresses the parenting of men who are abusive or violent in their relationships and in their families. There are very few interventions for this. Standard parenting programs are not really going to fit the bill, as a lot of that is about child management strategies, and we're about child relationship strategies, with an emphasis also on seeing that the child and the mother's safety are strongly connected. So the first of the principles is exactly as you might expect. The priority must be given to the safety and well-being of children. So if there is anything that conflicts with that priority, that is coming second. This has to be always and forever the most important thing to us. That means in practice that we would assess and monitor changes in men's risk for violence, the need for coordinated case management, as I've mentioned already, but we would also set specific goals and ask father about his progress towards ensuring the child is safe from their abuse. We share information openly with referral agencies, and we're very clear with fathers that we're working with about that from the very start. We're transparent about it, we tell them about it, and we also tell the fathers what information we are sharing. We provide feedback along 4 domains, essentially, about motivation, engagement, willingness to and ability to put child-centered fathering into practice, and acceptance of responsibility for past abusive behaviours, criteria of that nature. Again, we would share that with the man and also with the system. At times, we may have to have rather difficult conversations. Sometimes a man will not see his children as frequently. Not all the outcomes in the program are going to be great for father. Usually they are positive, but there may be times when the interests of the child mean that father would have perhaps less contact or involvement with the child. So when we're thinking about the system, we think about children's services being the most likely referral source. So therefore, that means social workers and other staff, and that would mean staff on the front line, but also senior managers, need clear information about the program, what it tries to do, how communication will work, and most importantly, that there will be eyes on the child. In our system, it is mainly the social worker who carries out that function. You may be able to achieve that in various different ways, but it will be unethical to conduct a program of this nature without making sure that somebody is monitoring the safety of the child and what impact father's attendance in the program may have on the child. So this clearly might require agency interaction at management and delivery levels, For commissioners and so on and so forth, people need to be very clear about what the program does and does not do. In a very early version of the program, in a pilot that I worked on, people thought we were a anger management program, which we are most certainly not. So there was something about the messages we were sending out that were not clear, and we had to kind of fix that. So clear information at the start of the program, and also making sure that somebody has eyes on the child. We might think about what works for interprofessional working. This is research taken from a health context, but it applies equally to other interprofessional contexts. Clearly, the personal qualities of the people involved, perhaps their emotional intelligence and professionalism might come into that. The commitment of staff. There's certainly been no lack of commitment on part of the people who've been delivering this program. I've seen them struggle through many challenges along the way, including COVID. There needs to be open and transparent communication within the teams and across the teams. And it's always a good idea to create opportunities to work together. We should be clear about our goals and what our common purpose might be. And we should act with respect for other team members, regardless of where they are in the hierarchy or what profession they have or what professional status they have. It is always helpful to understand people's roles and expertise and to have a sense of what people can and cannot do within their professional remit. That means, of course, that we must be open to learning about other jobs and other professions and other roles. And it's generally very helpful to have effective facilitative, that means empowering leadership, and that we aim for cohesion, that we're working as one. So that's what we know that works well. Some things don't work so well. Excuse me, I must close the door. I'm sorry about that. When you're doing all this remote working, real life has a tendency to intrude. So what gets in the way of good interprofessional working? Well, patriarchal relationships, by which I mean patronizing, domineering, one-way authority relationships, don't tend to kind of help. People don't feel heard. They don't feel like they have an important contribution to make. It's not, in the modern era, a very good way to work interprofessionally. Time, obviously, we all have constraints on our time, on how much time we can devote to things. Gender plays a part, perhaps relating also to patriarchal relationships, that we still have some problems with gender, accepting that women could be in positions of authority, and perhaps as men, we need to do still a little bit of work about listening to women in positions of authority. Sometimes in interprofessional groups, lack of role clarification, who's supposed to be doing what and why. So quite often it's a good idea when you start off, even in the kind of smallest way of talking to even one professional, to kind of be clear about what I am doing, what I'm supposed to do, and what are you doing, what can my mutual expectations be. Culture, well, we could talk about that for a long time, but culture of organizations quite often is very persistent, goes on over a long period of time, and may not actually match with what the organization says it is supposed to do. Geographical separation, obviously, sometimes, for example, if people are working in rural areas, services may be very difficult to access, they may be far away, there may be costs involved in just getting groups of people together. This may be sometimes mitigated by the fact that we can do online work, but really we need to think about what might be the consequences for the families and people we're working with. Different employers may give people time to do things, may not give time for people to do things, may have different set of priorities, which might not enable some interagency or interprofessional working. There are, of course, always going to be professional boundaries and, surprise, surprise, hierarchical role boundaries. So you could kind of sum these up in saying that barriers can be interorganizational. Differences in power and resources available to groups may impact on collaboration. So, for example, quite often small charitable NGOs might find it difficult to work with larger statutory organizations because there's quite significant differences in power and resources. There may be perceived or actual differences in status, training, and skills. Fairly straightforward, I think. And so more kind of subtle discrimination and bias entering into these. It may not be spoken, but race, class, gender, disability, sexuality may come into play in some of these interprofessional arenas in an unhelpful way. So we also have to think about the facilitators. If they are thinking systemically, their focus also needs to be on the family system. So one of the things that we promote, for example, is the need to understand the family system. And we do genograms with all the men who come on the program, and they share them with each other. In this way, they learn about family patterns and systems outside of their own, but also the facilitators get a very clear notion about the most important relationships, where there might be vulnerabilities for particular children and so on in family systems. So again, but we also think about child development. Now, I have already said at the start of this that priority must be given to the safety of children. One of our learnings is that men quite often do not have any knowledge of child development and have very unrealistic ideas about what children at different times and stages of their development might be interested in or might be learning about or can do. So in a kind of fairly straightforward way, a lack of child development and appropriate child development knowledge can of itself be a risk to children. So that's why we bring that into the program, and we actually teach the men about those things. So our second principle is that children's safety and well-being is intrinsically connected to that of their mothers. I am reading it out directly, but it's worth it. So we would like always, where we're delivering a program, that at least one of the facilitators has an understanding and a background, perhaps, and at least an appreciation of the dynamics of woman abuse. Now, we generally don't find that that's a problem. But if that's not going to be possible within the dynamic of the team who are delivering the program, then they probably need to do something about that. So contact with mothers, as I've said, is one component of the intervention, and it's an offer. We do not force women to take up that offer, but we certainly leave the door open and make sure that she has contact details. Maybe she doesn't want to talk to us today, but she might in a month or two. And the door is open to her for that conversation. Where possible, we like to collaborate with battered intervention services. That's essentially perpetrator programs, but those programs are not available in all communities, so that might not be possible. But where it is possible, you should reach your hand out and get in contact with them. Two programs may work well collaboratively. We must always be thinking about the man's ability to maintain a non-violent or non-abusive relationship with the children's mother. We know all about the effect of domestic violence and abuse on children, so therefore we should really be paying close attention to that in the room when we are working with the fathers. We also think about it outside the room, because it may be that risk issues are might come up in a group or some other sort of interaction with the man, and we have to be connected sufficiently into the system, not only to talk to her about that, perhaps, if that was appropriate, but certainly talk to other professionals who are working with her. So domestic abuse is generally a part of the men's profile almost invariably with all the men that we have worked with. If we fail to engage these fathers, I have said it already, nobody's doing anything with them, nobody will change their risk, and they will continue. They don't generally take a vow of celibacy and go off and join a monastery. They generally, in our experience, have a tendency to go on and have other children in other families where they are generally at a higher risk than in their biological family. We need to be careful about a failed referral, and in particular those men who will come on for a period of time, like say 6 or 7 sessions and drop off. We have to be very careful. That's probably not always, but an indicator of a higher risk man if they keep on repeating patterns of that behavior in this and other interventions. When we are thinking about mothers' interventions with the system, there's some quite well established research that tells us, well, what acts as barriers for victims or mothers interacting with the system. It may be that the system's attitude toward domestic violence and victim blaming is a barrier. There may be previous societal, cultural, or personal experiences that informs the way that she interacts or otherwise with the system. We should not, of course, forget the severity and extent of emotional abuse and the effect that that might have on a person. One of the effects of domestic abuse is that people often feel that they lose their sense of agency, their ability to assert themselves, the ability to make choices about what they want to and do not want to do, their feelings of worthlessness on occasion. Not always, but those personal factors are consequences of abuse and may then have consequences for how a person will or will not interact with the system. On occasion, people do not recognize what is happening as being abusive. They may feel that this is normal family behavior and this is how things are. So that itself can be a barrier. But of course, the victim may be scared. Scared of all number of things, scared of him, scared of making choices, scared of doing something different, scared of the gaps between system, anxious about what might happen to her children. All of those things are playing out all the time. And of course, there may be material, social and legal factors. Legal might be about the right to live in a certain jurisdiction. Maybe they don't have a passport or a right to remain, whatever. Materials, quite simply, they may not have money. And social might be, for example, they're under pressure from their own family to keep their mouth shut and not say or do anything about what they're experiencing. We can have abuser dependence. So she's dependent on him for finances, etc., and things of that nature. Her economic status, maybe she's not working, she's got no skills, not likely she will get a job. It's not the case for all women, of course, who experience domestic abuse, but if it is a factor for women, it's a significant barrier. Legal status, access to legal services, child responsibility status, and that might be about things like perhaps if it's a reconstituted family and there's a number of children, but she may be the biological parent of one child but not the other. These complications of that nature can arise. Social integration and support, and in a sense, speak for itself, as do, of course, language or other communication barriers. You could summarize in saying that some people, some mums, have negative perceptions of the social care and justice systems, that there may not be availability and accessibility for victim support, legal advocacy and information services. There may be factors at the interface with system and professionals, including previous experience, and it may be that there simply are no safety measures available. Services are very differently developed and evolved in different jurisdictions or even in different parts of the same jurisdiction. We also need to be quite aware of what are the significant risk issues. If you wanted a snapshot of the 6 things you should be looking out for, it's separation. Lethal violence tends to happen in the period at the end of the relationship, particularly where there are disputes about child contact. Perhaps returns as to that earlier slide where we saw get him out of the house and then we'll be safer. We actually know that the end of the relationship, which we have just created, is actually peak risk period for lethal violence. I'm not saying don't do that, but I'm saying if we're making that choice, we should do so with our eyes open. Pregnancy and new birth, what we would call the perinatal period, is well known. About 30% of domestic abuse starts or escalates in the perinatal period. If things are escalating, if they're getting worse, best person to ask about that is mother. If there are cultural issues and sensitivity, that can work in two ways. An abusive person may use cultural justifications, which of course do not hold water. There is no justification in any culture. Well, if I looked in the Bible, I would find reasons. I'm from a Judeo-Christian tradition and background. I could probably find a justification. I could equally find a justification for not behaving in that way. So some people will take cultural justifications from religion or from other contexts which are not justifiable, but nonetheless are kind of another tool of abuse, as it were. Another issue is that professionals are sometimes scared of causing offense, of talking to people who are not from perhaps the same culture, the same race, the same religious tradition, and are worried about causing offense. This is definitely from some of the major child protection inquiries in the UK, is an actual issue. It's not just something that I've dreamed up. So again, that could be a high risk factor. Any case where there is stalking, by which I mean the person is routinely following the person, not just physically, but perhaps using social media and other things of that nature, getting third parties to follow the person, those kind of behaviors. Stalking tends to be very persistent, it's very psychologically damaging, and it is again associated with both lethal and high risk violence. If there's a history of sexual assault, we also know that that's a particularly high risk issue where domestic abuse cases are concerned. If we're seeing a cluster of these issues, then that's something we should really be paying close attention to. So, guiding principle 3, kind of may not be surprising after those last few slides, but we need to be thinking about working with men whose motivation for change may be low. So to better yourself in your relationships with your family might get you somewhere, but quite often our clients need a bit of a push. And that's why we're generally working with people within children's services and the criminal justice system. So we need to have a strong relationship with referrers. But remember, our first goal of intervention is engagement. The idea is get them in the room. Later on, I am going to be talking to him in quite a challenging way quite often about his behavior. But at the moment, that's not my job. My first job is to get him in the room, form a therapeutic alliance with him, build a baseline on which we can actually learn and progress together. So if facilitators are skilled at motivational interviewing or similar sorts of approaches, that is a really important thing to be able to bring into the room, as it were. So some of the more general research says that intervention should take a therapeutic position rather than didactic. We're not teaching or authoritarian, and we're not finger wagging and telling, because some things don't work very well. We may actually, in fact, occasionally use an educational approach. We may give out straight information in the program, and we may be authoritative and kind of draw the line and kind of say, no, I don't think so. But our therapeutic position, they are not the first things in our toolbox. We should be empathic rather than confrontational. They are better at fighting than you. They do it more often, essentially, really. Our empathy is more powerful than our challenge, particularly in the early stages. Now, I will challenge later on, but I'll have to think about how do I do that. It's really important. Confrontational. I wonder who I am making happy when I feel like I am kind of putting him in his place, because essentially at the end of a group, I do not have to go home with them. And they feel great that I've won the argument. I'm not sure that I've actually helped the situation. That's really the mindset we need all the time. So we should adopt an ideographic rather than one size fits all. Essentially, really, that is about just kind of seeing the person in front of us and working with them. And we should be respectful. After all, that's the kind of behavior we want to see him mirror in his fathering, not punitive, pejorative, putting him down, insulting him, or moralizing about what's right and wrong. So, as I said, this does not mean that we avoid challenging conversations, but the timing is important. This is the well-known Francesca Di Clemente cycle of change, which is used in all sorts of interventions. So it may be a good idea to think about, where is he on this cycle of change? What should my behavior be like, given that he's at that particular set of stage? And at the start, I'm sorry, I've noticed that there's 2 typos in this slide. My job, first of all, is get him in the room, is what we call it. Then I'll build motivation with them. And then we can go on to direct challenge. Now, of course, things aren't quite so linear. Quite often the men are coming in and from the very start, they're very open and honest about their behavior, and they know why they're there, and they're willing to talk about it. But not all the men in the group are going to be like that. And I really have to think, well, what's my job here now? What should I be doing? So if you're thinking about starting to talk to fathers in the first place, when you meet him, let him talk. A colleague of mine always asks him if he knows why he is here, because quite often, not always, but at least sometimes, men are kind of confused by the system and don't know why they have actually been sent to see me. Ask him about his perception of what is happening in the family, including involvement with services and the various different professions that he's involved in. Listen carefully to him. Don't fight him. Not at this stage. Not ever. The first job of the facilitator, have I said this enough times now, is to get him in the room. Essentially, if we could have fixed what was going on with one conversation, we would have done that already. This is a process, not an event. And we need to kind of approach it in that sort of a way. So the focus needs to be the promotion of child-centered fathering rather than building on child management skills. Essentially, a lot of the dads really, their child management is by fear, and sometimes by fear and the use of violence also. So we're not going to teach them how to control child behavior, because they do a lot of that already. So let's think about a different way for doing things. So it's very helpful if we have people who are used to working with families about parenting problems, child management and things of that nature, because that brings a new set of skills that may be really very used to us. And again, we should be communicating with the program and referral agents and the system, as it were, about the content of the program. And think about services for children's mother when fathers have undermined her ability to parent and to discipline. Quite often, mothers, particularly if they experience domestic abuse over a period of time, are completely lacking in any sense of self-confidence or their own sense of authority with their own children, and they might have to, kind of relearn some of that, really. Or perhaps she has been overly kind of controlling with children, and she sometimes mums also hit kids, and maybe then we need to give her the time and space to think about doing things differently. So bear those things in mind. So an example of not teaching discipline, on the left hand side we have timeout, 1, 2, 3 consequences, removal of privileges, all these kind of things that would normally happen in a parenting program, and in fact, and I'm sure in a large number of our families. However, we're not, generally speaking, kind of living in families where abuse is common. So really we're more working on this kind of thing to try to get dads to think about what the underlying issue is and why the child is getting attention from this behavior, what's actually going on here. We don't go, they're just seeking attention. We go, they are seeking attention. Can you work out why that is? That we change demands. Some demand have extremely unrealistic demands of their children, which are not very helpful. Arrange situations so the problem doesn't come up. And we do spend a fair bit of time talking about praise, recognition, natural consequences, things of that nature. I'm not going to go into them in any more detail than that, but to say that we do need to talk about discipline in families, but we have a different approach, and certainly a different approach than a lot of the men we're working with. It's a kind of an interesting principle, but essentially really dads have eroded their children's emotional security. So they have to learn to be patient, to rebuild that trust in that relationship, and also to recognize that sometimes that trust will never get back to the situation or the place it was. So we very, very much need to think about the voice for the child in case planning. That's in the system and in the room. I often think that another little mantra of mine for the program is that the parents make so much noise that the children cannot be heard. So our responsibility as facilitators is to make that voice heard. We want dads to think about developing safe and predictable relationships. Predictable is very important. Children are quite conservative really in that regard. They want things to be the same. They don't want too much disruption. And for some of the kids, it's mostly being disruption. We need to talk about these things and the impact of past abuse, not only on the child's mum, but on the children themselves, and feedback to men and to system partners when dads are not making the changes required to keep children safe. So I've been using this graphic for a number of years. I won't go through it now, but when we are listening to children's voice, we may have to listen very carefully because they may articulate that voice in a number of different ways. The children's experience of domestic abuse. We've got to remember that co-occurrence of domestic abuse and child abuse is very common. I'm thinking about child abuse in the broadest sense, and that includes child sexual abuse. In fact, we would say that the occurrence of domestic abuse in a family where there are children is child abuse, that it is directly a form of child abuse, not just the context in which it occurs. The impact on parental capacity, we've talked about a little bit already, but certainly there can be an impact on child development, both cognitive, physical, emotional, and psychological. And of course, there may be other adversities happening at the same time as the family violence. But also, we also need to think that about children's resilience, children's ability to protect themselves, to develop strategies to manage, and to make sure that we listen carefully to those and that we support children's existing strategies where they have them. That might be done through direct work with children, but it also might be done through system responses. So these are the kind of things that we might consider when assessing children. I think before I start with any of that, I would think about that children in a family are not a homogeneous group, that we must think of each individual child within the family. Quite often I see professional reports and it says things like the children have been affected by the volatile relationship between the parents, with no more detail. So I'm knowing that this group of children are likely to be affected, but having done children's groups, and any child protection social worker listening to this will immediately know that two children can apparently live in the same family, experience the same things, and have completely different attitudes, feelings, thoughts, and outcomes as a result of that experience. The severity and nature and length of time the child is exposed to the violence is also very important, as are gender, ethnic origin, and so on. We need also to think about the supporting factors going on, the warmth, support the child receives in the relationship with their mother, siblings, other family members, their extended family members, or members of people in their community, the child's wider relationship and social work, and their child's capacity for an actual level of self-protection. So it's kind of things that when we're assessing systemically, we need to be thinking about. For facilitators, they need to be really well versed and totally understand what's going on, but not valuing children. This is a little model that we use on the program. We use this with the men, and our expectation is that the facilitators are also keenly tuned into these materials. Resilience needs protective factors. It's not all about risk. So this notion that we can promote the idea that there will be an end to abuse, that safety is a possibility in reality, to support children's own resources and their social competence, to think about developmentally supportive routines and so on. So I won't go through the list. Many of you are child social workers, so I don't think I really need to kind of go over what you already know. But these are the kind of things that we need to be thinking about when we're assessing children and the impact of the program for them. But it is not about what happens always when fathers change. Clearly that is very important. But what happens when he does not change? We see sometimes in systems what happens is, oh, well, he didn't do that, and we just ignore him, and we just give up. The fact that he has given up and shows that he is not motivated, perhaps, to change his behavior, or not capable of changing his behavior, or not willing to. We have to think very carefully about what message father is sending to the family system when he says that. What does that mean for mother, children, and the father? Are we willing to engage in that conversation with him and with the system, and perhaps with the family? So I love it when they change, and they do, but they don't always change. That gives us a different responsibility. So thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to you today. It was just wonderful to be able to work with all the wonderful people I have met in Estonia, Latvia, and Slovenia, both in the trainings and conversations, and also some of the, shall we say, social events that were had. It's just a great pleasure for myself and my colleague Elaine. I have to offer particular thanks to Sigrid and Kita, just for years of it, really, for their perseverance and good humour, their dedication, their professionalism, and in particular, their commitment to making this happen, their commitment to doing something about domestic abuse in their communities, and their commitment to working with fathers. And of course, I couldn't end without saying thank you to all the children, women and men who've been involved in the project. I haven't met you, but I know that change is possible, and it does happen. Thank you very much.